She walked into Judge Frank Caprio's courtroom wearing a $3,000 designer suit, diamond earrings that could pay off a family's mortgage, and the kind of confidence that only comes from a lifetime of never hearing the word no. Madison Ashford, daughter of Senator Richard Ashford, one of the most powerful politicians in Rhode Island, had just been charged with assaulting a decorated war veteran in a restaurant parking lot. And she thought her last name would make it all disappear. But what Madison didn't know was that the veteran she assaulted, retired Marine Sergeant James Rodriguez, was Judge Caprio's former student, a man who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and came home with a Purple Heart. What happened next would become the most viral courtroom moment of the year, a takedown so devastating that even Madison's powerful father couldn't stop the consequences. My name is Judge Frank Caprio, and I've been on this bench for over 35 years. I've seen entitled people before, but Madison Ashford took it to a level that shocked even me. If you believe that political power should never place anyone above the law, hit that subscribe button right now. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and stay until the end because what I did to this senator's daughter will restore your faith that justice still exists. This is the story of how privilege met consequence, and how one young woman learned that some things daddy's money and political influence simply cannot fix. Madison Ashford was born into political royalty. Her father, Senator Richard Ashford, had held office for 20 years and chaired the powerful Judiciary Committee. Her mother, Catherine Ashford, was a socialite whose name appeared on every charity board in Providence. Madison grew up in a mansion on Rhode Island's elite East Side, attended the most exclusive private schools, and graduated from Yale University with mediocre grades that daddy's donations helped secure. She currently worked at her father's political consulting firm, a position she obtained not through merit but through the oldest form of job security, being the boss's daughter. In Providence social circles, Madison was known as untouchable. She had an Instagram following of 250,000 people who watched her post about private jets, designer shopping sprees, and exclusive parties that most people could only dream about attending. But behind the glamorous social media facade was a pattern of behavior that would shock anyone who believed in accountability. This wasn't Madison's first run-in with the law. It wasn't even her fourth. 2 years ago, she was arrested for driving under the influence after leaving an exclusive nightclub. Her blood alcohol level was 0.15, nearly twice the legal limit. The arresting officer reported that Madison laughed when being breathalyzed and told him that her father would have his badge. The case was mysteriously dismissed after Senator Ashford met privately with the police chief. The officer who made the arrest was quietly transferred to night shift traffic duty, and the entire incident disappeared from public records as if it had never happened. 18 months ago, Madison was caught shoplifting at a high-end boutique. Security cameras captured her taking $2,400 worth of merchandise and walking out without paying. The store owner initially pressed charges, but after several phone calls from the senator's office, those charges vanished. The store owner later lost his lease on the building, which happened to be owned by one of the senator's close political allies. 1 year ago, Madison was involved in a hit and run in a restaurant parking lot. She damaged 3 cars while intoxicated and drove away from the scene. Witnesses got her license plate number and reported it to police. Charges were filed, then mysteriously withdrawn after what the prosecutor's office called settlement negotiations. The victims later admitted they were paid significant amounts of money and warned that if they pursued the case, they might face IRS audits that could destroy their small businesses. 6 months ago, Madison got into a physical altercation with a valet at an exclusive country club. She slapped the young man across the face after he took what she considered too long retrieving her car. The valet, a college student working his way through school, initially filed charges. Then he suddenly moved back to Guatemala with his family, and the country club's membership board, which included several of the senator's closest friends, voted to dismiss the incident entirely. Every single time Madison broke the law, her father's political power made the consequences disappear. She had learned that rules applied to other people, not to her. She had never been held accountable for anything in her entire privileged life. And that pattern of enabling and protection had created a monster who believed she could do absolutely anything without facing justice. But that was all about to change on a Friday night at the Harbor Club restaurant, when Madison's sense of entitlement would finally collide with a man who represented everything she had never learned to respect. The Harbor Club was Providence's most exclusive waterfront restaurant, the kind of place where reservations required a 2-month wait and dinner cost $200 per person minimum. On that Friday night in October, the restaurant was filled with Rhode Island's elite, business owners, lawyers, doctors, and old money families who treated the establishment like their private dining room. Among them was James Rodriguez, a 42-year-old retired Marine sergeant, celebrating his 15th wedding anniversary with his wife Maria. James had saved for 6 months to afford this dinner. It represented a significant financial sacrifice for a high school guidance counselor who spent his days mentoring at-risk youth and helping students nobody else bothered to help. James had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and earned a Purple Heart after an improvised explosive device tore through his convoy in Helmand province. He had pulled 2 fellow Marines from a burning vehicle before being evacuated himself, sustaining injuries that left him with partial hearing loss in his left ear and shrapnel permanently embedded in his leg. He came home with post-traumatic stress disorder and worked through it with therapy and tremendous personal strength. Now he dedicated his life to helping teenagers navigate their own struggles, offering them the guidance and support he wished he'd had during his darkest days after returning from war. At 9:45 that evening, James and Maria finished their anniversary dinner. James paid the $287 bill, a significant expense that he considered worth every penny to celebrate the woman who had stood by him through deployments, injuries, and the long process of healing. They exited through the restaurant's main doors holding hands, both in good spirits, captured on security cameras walking through the parking lot with the unhurried pace of a couple savoring a special evening. At 9:47, Madison Ashford emerged from the same restaurant with 3 friends, all of them visibly intoxicated. She was laughing loudly, stumbling in expensive high heels, while her friends tried to steady her. The valet brought her white BMW X5, an $80,000 vehicle that had been a gift from her father. Madison tipped the young man $5 and climbed into the driver's seat despite being obviously drunk. What happened next would be captured on multiple security cameras and cell phone videos from at least a dozen witnesses. Madison backed out of her parking spot without looking, never checking her mirrors or the backup camera that her luxury vehicle was equipped with. She reversed directly into James Rodriguez, who was walking behind her car with his wife. The impact knocked James to the ground hard. Maria screamed as her husband hit the pavement, his dress shirt tearing, his elbow scraping across the asphalt. Madison kept reversing, completely unaware that she had just struck a pedestrian. Maria pounded on Madison's car window, screaming that she had hit someone. Madison stopped her vehicle, annoyed by the noise, and rolled down her window. When Maria frantically explained that Madison had just run into her husband, Madison's response was delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who had never been taught empathy. She looked at Maria and said, slurring her words, "Well, maybe he should watch where he's walking." James got up slowly, his war injury aggravated by the impact, his limp now more pronounced. He approached Madison's window calmly and professionally, identifying himself and requesting that she stop to exchange insurance information as required by law. Madison looked at him with irritation and told him he was being dramatic, that she had barely touched him. When James pulled out his phone to call the police, Madison became enraged. She exited her vehicle, so intoxicated that she could barely stand upright, and approached James aggressively. Multiple witnesses would later describe her as extremely drunk, unstable on her feet, and verbally combative. James explained calmly that he was calling the police because she was clearly intoxicated and had just hit a pedestrian. Madison's response revealed everything about how she viewed the world and her place in it. She looked at this decorated combat veteran and said, "Do you know who I am? My father is Senator Richard Ashford. You're nobody." James continued dialing. Madison tried to grab his phone from his hands. James pulled it away, stepping back in a non-aggressive defensive movement, simply protecting his property. Madison then screamed that he had touched her, even though he hadn't, and lunged forward to strike him across the face with her open hand. The slap echoed across the parking lot. Maria screamed. Multiple witnesses gasped in shock. A security guard began running toward the incident. But Madison wasn't finished. She wound up and punched James in the chest with a closed fist. James, a trained Marine who could have easily defended himself, stood perfectly still with his hands at his sides, his phone still recording everything. Then Madison said the words that would ensure this case would never be quietly dismissed like her previous incidents. She screamed at James Rodriguez, a man who had risked his life for his country, "You probably stole your medals anyway. Fake soldier." The parking lot erupted in shocked reactions. Multiple restaurant patrons who had been witnesses to Madison's assault immediately began recording on their cell phones. The restaurant manager arrived with additional security personnel. Madison, realizing that people were watching and recording, immediately switched tactics with the practiced ease of someone who had talked her way out of consequences many times before. She began screaming that James had attacked her, that she was the victim, that she wanted him arrested immediately. When the security guard calmly informed her that everything had been captured on the restaurant's security cameras, Madison's response was chilling in its entitlement. She looked directly at the security guard and said with absolute confidence, "I don't care what your cameras show. My father will bury this place." Within minutes, police officers arrived on scene. Officer Michaels and Officer Torres approached the situation professionally, ready to hear all sides. Madison immediately began directing them, pointing at James and demanding his arrest. She introduced herself as Senator Ashford's daughter and explained that this man had assaulted her and that she needed the officers to handle the situation appropriately. Officer Michaels asked to hear from all parties involved. Madison became indignant, insisting there were no other sides to hear, that she was the victim and James needed to be arrested immediately. James Rodriguez, despite having just been struck multiple times and verbally degraded, responded with the calm dignity that defined his character. He identified himself as a retired Marine, explained that Madison had backed into him with her vehicle, and then assaulted him when he attempted to call for help. He informed the officers that he had video evidence on his phone, that the restaurant had security footage, and that at least 20 witnesses had observed the entire incident. Officer Torres asked Madison if she had been drinking. Her response was to demand to know if the officer understood who her father was, as if that question somehow answered whether she had consumed alcohol. The restaurant manager provided security footage to the police on a tablet, and both officers reviewed the clear video evidence showing Madison backing into James, Madison becoming aggressive, Madison striking James multiple times, and Madison's verbally abusive behavior throughout the encounter. Officer Michaels informed Madison that she was being placed under arrest for assault and battery, driving under the influence, and leaving the scene of an accident. Madison's reaction was to threaten both officers' careers, screaming that her father chaired the Judiciary Committee, that he approved police budgets, and that both officers would be directing traffic by Monday morning if they dared to arrest her. As Officer Torres placed handcuffs on Madison and read her Miranda rights, she continued screaming threats and insults. She told James that he would regret crossing her, that nobody disrespected her and got away with it, that she would ensure he suffered consequences for daring to report her behavior. James, with the quiet strength that came from surviving actual combat, simply replied that he had risked his life for this country and would not be disrespected by someone who had never sacrificed anything for anyone. Madison was placed in the police car, where she kicked at the doors and screamed obscenities while her friends frantically made phone calls to the senator's office. James declined the ambulance that was offered, despite his ribs hurting from the assault and his war injury being aggravated by the impact. He told the officers he had survived worse, and he and Maria provided their statements with the thoroughness and clarity of people who understood the importance of documentation. Within 15 minutes of Madison's arrest, Senator Ashford's chief of staff arrived at the police station, even before Madison had been processed. He demanded to speak with the precinct captain and spent 30 minutes behind closed doors. Madison was released on personal recognizance with no bail required. She walked out of the police station smirking, saw news cameras that had already arrived, and shouted that this was a complete misunderstanding and that the veteran was lying. She climbed into her father's black SUV with tinted windows and disappeared into the night, confident that this situation would be handled the way all her previous legal problems had been handled. But something unexpected happened that Madison and her father had not anticipated. An employee at the Harbor Club, disgusted by Madison's behavior and her threats against the restaurant, anonymously leaked the security footage to local news stations. Within 2 hours, the video had 500,000 views. By morning, it had gone viral with millions of people watching Madison Ashford assault a decorated veteran while calling him a fake soldier. Senator Ashford held a press conference Saturday morning, calling the incident an unfortunate misunderstanding and claiming his daughter had been defending herself. He never mentioned that James Rodriguez was a veteran. He never apologized. He never acknowledged his daughter's pattern of behavior. The press conference backfired spectacularly as journalists hammered him with questions about Madison's previous dismissed charges and why she seemed to receive special treatment. National veterans organizations issued strong statements condemning Madison's actions and her disgraceful fake soldier comment. The story exploded across national media. The hashtag Justice for James began trending on social media platforms with hundreds of thousands of people demanding accountability. By Sunday, Senator Ashford's office issued a second carefully worded statement claiming they had full confidence in the judicial process, a statement that everyone understood as code for their confidence that they could make this case disappear like all the others. On Monday morning, the case was officially assigned to Judge Frank Caprio. The senator's office immediately attempted to request a different judge, claiming potential bias, but their request was denied by the chief judge who was conveniently unavailable for further comment. The public pressure was immense and unrelenting. The assault video reached 5 million views within 3 days. Veterans groups organized outside the courthouse, standing in silent vigil. Petitions demanding accountability gathered over 200,000 signatures. James Rodriguez gave a single television interview where he handled every question with grace and dignity, saying only that he wanted justice to work the way it was supposed to work, equally for everyone, because that was what he had fought for overseas. Madison's Instagram account was flooded with outraged comments from people disgusted by her behavior. She made her account private, but screenshots of her previous posts mocking ordinary people and flaunting her privilege circulated widely. Senator Ashford's approval rating dropped 15 points in a single week. Political opponents called for him to recuse himself from any Judiciary Committee decisions given his daughter's legal troubles and his history of interfering in her cases. Local businesses began posting signs in their windows expressing support for veterans and making clear that entitled behavior would not be tolerated in their establishments. The city of Providence, which had watched Madison Ashford escape consequences for years, had finally reached its breaking point. This time, the evidence was too clear, the victim too sympathetic, and the public outrage too intense for the situation to be quietly buried. Thursday morning arrived, and the courthouse was surrounded by a media circus unlike anything Providence had seen in years. News vans from every local station and several national networks lined the streets. Veterans in uniform stood in silent rows holding signs that read "Respect our heroes, justice for James, and no one is above the law." Court security was overwhelmed by the crowds. Extra officers had been called in to manage the situation. The metal detectors backed up as hundreds of people tried to enter the building. The public gallery seats had been filled since 7 a.m. by people who had waited hours in line, desperate to witness whether this judge would finally hold the senator's daughter accountable or whether privilege would triumph over justice once again. At 9:30, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled up to the courthouse side entrance in an attempt to avoid the main media presence, but the strategy failed immediately. Reporters and cameras swarmed the vehicle. Madison Ashford emerged wearing a Chanel suit worth over $4,000, Gucci sunglasses, and carrying a Hermes Birkin handbag that cost more than many people's cars. Her hair and makeup were professionally styled. She looked like she was attending a high society gala rather than a court hearing for assault charges. She was flanked by her attorney, Martin Whitmore, a man in his 60s from the most expensive law firm in Rhode Island, known throughout legal circles as the Fixer because of his remarkable success rate in getting wealthy clients' charges dismissed or reduced. Behind them walked Senator Richard Ashford himself, a bold and calculated move designed to send a clear message that he intended to influence these proceedings. He wore an American flag pin on his lapel and offered the cameras his practiced politician's smile while refusing to answer any shouted questions. Madison removed her sunglasses only after entering the building, visibly annoyed by the commotion and attention. She treated the security guards with obvious disdain, attempting to walk through the metal detector without emptying her expensive purse. When the guard politely informed her that everyone had to follow the same security procedures, Madison sighed dramatically as if this basic requirement was beneath her dignity. 15 minutes later, James Rodriguez arrived in his 12-year-old Honda Civic, parking in the public lot 3 blocks away because he couldn't afford the expensive courthouse parking. He walked to the building wearing his only suit, an off-the-rack $200 outfit he had purchased years ago for job interviews. He wore a small Marine Corps pin on his lapel and walked with the pronounced limp that had worsened since Madison's assault had aggravated his combat injury. His wife Maria walked beside him, holding his hand, wearing a simple department store dress and modest jewelry. They both looked nervous but carried themselves with quiet dignity. As James approached the courthouse entrance, the veterans who had been standing vigil outside suddenly snapped to attention. Several saluted. An elderly Vietnam veteran called out "Semper Fi, Sergeant," his voice breaking with emotion. James stopped walking, clearly uncomfortable with the attention but too respectful to ignore these men who had also served. He shook hands with several veterans, thanking them sincerely for coming and for their own service. When media reporters asked him for a comment, he paused, considered his words carefully, and spoke with the measured tone of a man who understood the weight of this moment. He said simply that he wanted justice to work the way it was supposed to work, equally for everyone, because that was what he had fought for. Then he walked into the courthouse through the main entrance like every other citizen, going through security without complaint. The guard who checked his identification recognized him from the news coverage and said quietly, "Thank you for your service, sir." James nodded his appreciation and continued inside. The courtroom was packed to capacity. Every seat in the gallery was filled. Veterans occupied the front rows, many still in uniform, sitting with military bearing in silent dignity. Behind them sat ordinary citizens who had taken the day off work to witness this historic moment. The press section overflowed with journalists and sketch artists, as cameras were not permitted in Judge Caprio's courtroom. On the left side near the defendant's table sat Senator Ashford in the front row, surrounded by his aides and political allies, all wearing expensive suits and radiating the kind of confidence that comes from years of wielding power. One aide remained on his phone until the bailiff firmly instructed him to put it away. On the right side near the prosecution table sat James and Maria Rodriguez quietly, with their hands folded. Behind them were more veterans, fellow guidance counselors James worked with, teachers from his school, students he had mentored over the years, and members of his community who believed in him. The contrast between the two sides of the courtroom was stark, representing two completely different Americas existing in the same space. At precisely 10 o'clock, the bailiff's voice rang out. All rise. The Municipal Court of Providence is now in session, the Honorable Judge Frank Caprio presiding. Judge Caprio entered from his chambers, 77 years old but still sharp and commanding. He wore his black robe with the dignity of someone who had spent 35 years on the bench and had seen every form of human behavior. He carried himself with a quiet authority that required no announcement or fanfare. He took his seat, surveyed the packed courtroom carefully, and his experienced eyes took in everything. He noticed the senator sitting prominently in the front row. He noticed the rows of veterans. He noticed the media presence. He noticed James Rodriguez sitting with his wife. His expression revealed nothing, but those who knew Judge Caprio well could see the slight set to his jaw that indicated he fully understood the significance of this case and what it represented for the community. Please be seated, Judge Caprio said, his voice calm and measured. The room obeyed instantly, the silence profound. He spent a long moment reviewing the papers before him, and the silence stretched uncomfortably. Senator Ashford shifted in his seat. Madison checked her phone under the table until her attorney elbowed her sharply to stop. Judge Caprio looked up, removed his reading glasses, and spoke with the clarity and authority that had defined his career. The State of Rhode Island versus Madison Catherine Ashford, case number 2024-CR-8847. He paused, looking directly at Madison with eyes that had seen through countless defendants' facades over 3.5 decades. Miss Ashford, please approach the bench with your counsel. Madison stood, smoothed her designer suit with practiced elegance, and walked to the defendant's table with her head held high. There was confidence in her posture, bordering on arrogance. She had been carefully coached by her expensive attorney. She looked poised and controlled. But there was something unmistakable in the way she carried herself, an assumption that this was all performance, that the outcome had already been decided in her favor, that her father's power and her attorney's reputation would make this unpleasantness disappear just like all the times before. Attorney Whitmore stood beside her with his expensive briefcase and pristine legal pads, every prop of power and success on display. He placed his hand briefly on Madison's shoulder, a signal for her to remain calm and let him handle everything. Senator Ashford leaned forward in his gallery seat, making his presence unmistakably known. Judge Caprio noticed but showed absolutely no reaction. The battle between privilege and justice was about to begin, and everyone in that courtroom knew they were witnessing something that would be remembered for years to come.